I disagree with one reason that Eamon just gave, and it's something he said in his speech as well. I don't think there is much ethnic homogeneity in CANZUK, in the Anglosphere more widely. One of the oddities of this debate is that everything is still conditioned by Brexit. It was our ultimate culture war. So a lot of people who were sore about Brexit have now argued themselves into this bizarre place where they don't want any trade deals with anyone because they want Brexit to fail, and they would rather that the country be poor and that they be proved right. And so the argument that they use against CANZUK is exactly that. They say, oh, you know, this is just imperial nostalgia, it's all these white countries. Seriously? All these white countries? Who has the higher ethnic minority population, would you say? CANZUK or the European Union? I'll tell you the figures we have. Australia doesn't keep figures, but in the UK, the non-white population is about between 12 and 13%, slightly more in the US, above 20% in Canada and New Zealand. In the EU as a whole, it's about 6%. Right? What we have in common is a way of looking at the world shaped by shared institutions that elevate the individual over the collective and that elevate the rules over the rulers. And those institutions, common law, the political heritage that goes back through the American Revolution, back through the English Civil War, back to the Great Charter, even back before that to the folk right of pre-Norman common law, those things habituate people to think in a particular way. And they explain in very broad terms why Bermuda is not Haiti, why Hong Kong is not China. It wasn't till very recently. Yeah, why Singapore is not Indonesia, why Israel isn't Syria, come to that. We tend not to think of Israel as a former British colony, but of course it is also a common law state with the same, if you like, interoperability of regulations and a similar attitude to property rights and so on. It's a model that works very well, and the reason that trade is a very natural solvent within that grouping of countries is that it's the most natural thing in the world to trade when you have a common understanding. Geographical proximity matters less and less. At the end of this lockdown, we're all much more accustomed to holding important, sensitive conversations over Zoom or Teams. It's much easier then to do that with a country where, or with a business where not only is it literally your language, but it's the same legal system, the same arbitration, the same accountancy model, all the rest of it. And that's why I see, if you like, this pivot by the UK back towards a more maritime and less continental geostrategy simply as a return to normal. You know, we lived through a highly unusual Cold War period when, for good but surprising and peculiar reasons, we had to focus on the defense of Western Europe because there was the Red Army was massed beyond the Elbe. That is no longer true, and I think inescapably, Brexit may hasten it slightly, but it was going to happen. Britain is going to raise its eyes to more distant horizons again.
Did you want to speak? Yeah. I don't know. I can.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to say, despite my accent, I am actually Austrian, so it may help with my questioning here. But the tribalism debate is very interesting, and as somebody from continental Europe, I'd like to address, where your rights come from and how it happens. You have your rights come from your nationality, or the place you live. Now, in the UK, first of all, you were subject to European rules of things, and then you left. But just before Brexit, you had, for instance, in Scotland, a referendum where they wanted to decide whether to stay within the UK or not. And just after Brexit, you had a lot of people who had the right to Irish nationality wanting to join due to their ancestry, wanting to rejoin the EU just by getting a new passport. So I'd like you maybe to address those points in tribalism.
I actually got myself an Irish passport because my grandfather was Irish. I didn't do it for any reasons of Brexit, I have to say. I did it because I had a feeling, a familial feeling, and that I thought it was only right that my children and grandchildren should be able to share in that nationality. It really is as deep and visceral as that, and you know, that's why I continue to say these things are very deep and important to people, and so it's not surprising that it really messes up trade.
Yeah, let me, well, not surprising, let me voice my disagreement. I think for most people it is. It is true that blood is thicker than water, but I think that's unfortunate. I think it's sad that that is the case, and that at the end of the day, what should be thicker is ideas. And you know, I think that the reason why these trade agreements, if they're focused on institutions and ideas, that is what makes sense. Now, maybe this is a consequence of the fact that my children, fourth generation born on a different continent, not just a different country, and the fact that, yeah, when I go to Israel, I kind of feel at home culturally, but I'm so glad I left. And that I lived for a long time in the United States, and today I live in Puerto Rico, and I feel at home wherever I go. So part of this is, I think, a personal thing, but I think it is the ideas, the character, that who you are as an individual, that what matters, and not, I think, where you come from, and those kind of bonds. I mean, think about all the people who left Europe 150 years ago and went to America knowing they would never see their relatives again, knowing they would never see the land from which they came again. And they went because of ideas. They went because they wanted a different future. They went because they wanted opportunities. They went because they wanted prosperity and abundance, and they were ambitious. You know, I think that's the kind of attitude that the Enlightenment shaped, of individuals pursuing their own self-interest, and that's what made America special. And I do think America is special as compared to Europe. You know, I might take a different perspective slightly than my two friends here on Brexit, and I'm generally for Brexit, primarily because it gives the UK an option value. I'm a finance guy, I believe in option values. To be freer. You will see if they take the option, right? We'll see if they actually execute on the option, if they turn out to be indeed freer than mainland Europe. But in many respects, I opposed Brexit, in the sense that there was no barriers to trade, there was no barriers to capital, there was no barriers to human mobility. I think that's wonderful that all of that existed between the UK and the rest of Europe. I wish it existed on a much more global scale, particularly on the issue of trade. I'd love to see trade and borders open up on a much larger scale than just the European Union. It's the governance of Europe and the movement towards more statism and authoritarianism and the leftism, which I think Brexit allowed the UK the option to escape. We'll see if they take it.
Of course, there were no barriers within Europe. That's true, or fewer barriers within Europe. But the price for that was more barriers around them. And I mean, if you were Slovakia or something, that may be a trade-off that you would make, because most of your trade is or Belgium even. For the UK, which was always tied by history and geography to other continents and archipelagos, by migration, ethnicity, by language and law, it never made as much sense. But I'm going to try something which is difficult in front of a partly Randian audience, which is to make a defense of the nation-state. Because in this imperfect Aristotelian sublunary world, right, the alternative to the nation-state is not some imaginary either objectivist or anarcho-capitalist or other libertarian paradise, right? Do not, for heaven's sake, make the mistake that the socialists make of saying, we reserve the right to be judged purely by some textbook theory and never by any real-world approximation of our ideas, right? So in the world in which we exist, I will argue strenuously that the nation-state is a more secure vessel for liberty than the alternatives. The most illiberal, authoritarian, destructive ideologies, fascism, communism, Islamic fundamentalism, indeed religious fundamentalism of any kind, all presume to be bigger than the nation-state, and they presume to knock down the evolved, organic, and natural loyalties that tend to secure personal freedom because they believe that they have a higher cause. I was very struck. It was a small detail, but it really stuck in my mind. It's one of the first things I remember. The signature act of the Iranian Revolution, signature act of the Islamic Revolution. Remember, it was the siege of the US Embassy. And it was only later that I thought, what a weird thing that was. I mean, to attack a legation building. You know, if the US invaded Venezuela tomorrow, we could safely assume that the diplomatic personnel would be safely evacuated through neutral countries, as happened during the Second World War, right? When the Falklands War was on, there was never any danger to Argentine diplomats here or to British diplomats there, right? What signal were you sending out when you decided to violate territorial sovereignty and national jurisdiction like that? What you were saying is, we don't recognize your rules, we don't recognize your world order, we answer to a higher cause, we get to decide what the law is. And they carried on as they'd begun, you know, attacking national sovereignty everywhere, you know, sponsoring militias in the Balkans, in Central Asia, even attacking a community center in Buenos Aires. Why Buenos Aires? What possible strategic value? To show that they could, because they don't recognize the nation state. And I think it is just worth making a practical case. During the Second World War, if you listen to the constant refrain in Allied propaganda, we are fighting for the cause of all nations, they understood that to be a bulwark against tyranny. I'm really interested in something else. Do you mind if I ask a question? I know time is short, but I'll put this to our questioner, but also to everyone else, because it's always really astounded me. Why isn't Austria, given the policies of successive Austrian governments on tax, on trade union rights, on employment, why isn't Austria in a worse mess? I always think it's quite useful to challenge your prejudice, right? If you come, as I do, from a basically free market point of view, Austria has pretty much gone down the checklist doing everything, not terribly, but doing a lot of things quite badly. And yet, low inflation, low unemployment, high growth, high standard of living. What are we missing?
We're going to get an answer.
Well, first of all, people get to choose which nation states they reside in, and usually you're subject to the laws of the state where you reside. You know, there are exceptions, like some countries tax their citizens worldwide, like the US, Libya, North Korea. But the rest of us actually apply their laws where you reside. And I, 10 years ago, moved to Switzerland because I kind of liked what was going on there rather than, you're right, a state such as Austria where you have the statists in control of 50% of the economy, and you have a top marginal tax rate of way over 55%, and all of those things that you're probably referring to. On the other hand, it is still a free market economy to a certain sense, and it succeeds because of a lot of small individual companies that manage to work within. And for the size of the Austrian economy, a country with 8 million people, you all probably have heard of Swarovski or Red Bull or Glock or any number of other countries. And then when I was bicycling down the Danube, I stopped in a town that nobody had ever heard of, and the local firm, which employed practically everybody there, had 99% of world market share in the production of synthetic cobalt blue. You know, when the snails gave it up, they made it out of petroleum, but these hidden champions are what make the country great. So unfortunately, more and more of these countries, because of what you said, more and more are leaving.
Remember, right, that's the theme of Atlas Shrugged, just to give a plug there, right? It's the atlases that hold up these countries. California is the same way, right? Why does California survive and thrive, you could even argue? It's because certain individuals, companies who keep it all going. I'll just say, I'm not opposed to nation state. It's a question of what kind of nation state you want. And whether the nation state respects the individual rights of its citizens, and indeed, you asked where rights come from. They don't come from the state. They don't come from your ethnicity. They are part of you as being human. You have rights now. So, do states respect rights? Is I think the key question, and the key question that actually ultimately drives all the other decisions, whether they do or they don't, and what spheres they do and they don't. So I'm all for nation states, free nation states that respect the individual rights of their citizens.
Okay, my next question is around tribalism in trade. It doesn't just manifest itself through tariffs and quotas and subsidies. It could also be something like a campaign that says, okay, we would like you to buy American. If you're going to buy a car, buy an American car. We're not going to penalize you if you don't, but we encourage you to do so. And this has happened in history in many countries. I remember there was one for Greeks. They really had to push us to buy Greek products because they weren't very good. But I think it happens also in Britain, like you have British meat and all that. So do you think that tribalism manifested in this way is as destructive if it has a similar effect in terms of people still make the same choices that they would have made if there were tariffs?
It's plainly not as destructive because there isn't the same, how do you judge the utility? If you want to buy an inferior product but it makes you feel patriotic, who am I to monetize the value of that? But the thinking behind it is crazy, and it's worth just dwelling for a moment. When Yaron said, everyone turned on a dime and bought this idea that America was getting poorer because it had a trade deficit. Again, that is an intuitive, plausible, and utterly wrong idea. Almost any non-economist, if told that their country has a persistent structural trade deficit, is very alarmed by that idea. And yet you can't really find any correlation between trade deficits and growth. No one. I mean, I have a really serious trade deficit with a number of the village pubs around where I live. The Bell and Dragon in Kingsclear, the White Hart in Overton, the Watership Down. I buy from them way, way more than I sell for them. Do you know what? Sometimes they engage in predatory pricing. Sometimes they engage in what is plainly defined as dumping. They give me stuff at below production price, like when they say have a free glass of wine with your meal on a Monday or whatever. Who gets the better end of that deal, right? How on earth have we maneuvered ourselves into a place where we think that cheap is a bad thing, where we think that buying goods at the most competitive price is somehow a swindle and is a cost to us? And I see this in Parliament all the time, almost always, actually, again, because of this old culture war of Brexit and people now wanting all of the trade deals to fail. And there was an absolutely brilliant example a few weeks ago where we were debating food poverty, and all these Labour and Lib Dem spokesmen were standing up saying, this is terrible, the richest 10% spend only 16% of their post-housing income on food, and for the poorest 10% it's 76%, and what can we do? And then the next debate happened to be on the Australia trade deal, and exactly the same people, without being aware of the contradiction, said, we've got to protect our country from being flooded by cheap food, right? And ultimately, it's two things coming together in their case. It's hostility to global Britain and alternatives to the EU, but it's also something that they know has much wider purchase, which is this intuitive hankering for autarky. The assertions on which mercantilism stands all sound perfectly reasonable. We have to protect our strategic industries. We can't compete with slave wage economies. We can't carry on with a permanent trade deficit. We should grow more of our own food. All of them, when translated into policy, serve to make a country needlessly poor.
How about retaliatory measures such as?
Again, it's crazy. I mean, there was an economist, I forget her name, but there was an economist in the 30s who said, if the other guy wants to put rocks in his harbour, you don't respond by putting rocks in your harbour. Yep.
And one last question for Yaron. So, do you think it's becoming harder to get rid of tribalism in epistemology because people are faced with more complicated questions, and the expertise that is required to get to the truth is not widely available? So then people would say, okay, I cannot do all that research by myself. It will take me too much time. It will be too hard. I don't have the energy or will to take all the time to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose which authority I'm going to trust, and then they choose that, maybe making an assessment of on the authority's abilities, maybe making an assessment of the authority's intentions.
So no, I don't think it's because the world is getting more complicated and it's harder to make decisions for yourself. We're very good at making those kind of decisions when we buy a computer, when we do day-to-day activities, even when we go to the doctor. Though I mean, in the UK it's a little different. But we get second opinions. We do some research online. It's easier today to do research online, much easier than it ever has been in human history. I think it's in those areas where politics intervenes is where we tend to then say, okay, but who has this opinion? I mean, there's a trend in the US right now where patients will not go see, if they're a Democrat, they won't go see a Republican doctor. And Republicans won't go see a doctor who's a Democrat. They literally ask their doctor who they voted for and decide whether to go to the doctor or not based on that. Now, that is sick. There's something really, really sick about that. And of course, there's a whole now, I was just reading, just last night, I was reading this thing about the James Beard Award. I don't know if you're familiar with James Beard Awards. They give awards for excellent chefs, the best chefs. And now the James Beard Awards are going to have a component of not just the quality of your food, but how socially conscious you are. That is, how socially just are you? Are you privileged, and to what extent does that privilege manifest itself, I guess, in your food? I don't know. So the award is now going to be, it's not that there's going to be a separate award for social justice. I mean, you can imagine that, okay. No, it's going to be interwound with the quality of your food. So imagine now that gets interwound with the quality of the surgery, right? I'll recommend a surgeon to you, not because he's good, but because he happens to have the right intersectionality score, right, in terms of social justice. And so it's gotten to the point where everything now is politicized. And this is a consequence of big government. This is a consequence of the fact that government is in all of our lives. Why does government have a position on COVID? Government shouldn't have a position on COVID. Government should do what government does, protect us. So it should be isolating people who test positive. It should be making sure that if you test positive, you don't infect other people. And other than that, leave us alone. Insurance companies and drug companies and doctors and hospitals and the private sector can handle distribution of vaccines far better than the government has. Just look at what Walmart does, Amazon does every single day, and look at how the US government distributed vaccines for COVID, where they trashed tens of thousands of doses because the wrong people were getting them based on some rigorous bureaucratic methodology on who should get them and who shouldn't. Imagine using the price mechanism to distribute vaccines. I know, even among free marketers, that is a bit of a difficulty. But it's not like only rich people would buy it. It's like companies would buy it, and insurance companies would want you to be vaccinated because they're insuring you, and it's your employer would want to buy them because they would want you to come back to work. And there's a lot of people that would buy these vaccines and pay a lot of money for them, and all of us would get vaccinated probably much faster. So why is everything today politicized? Because the government is in everything. Why is social media politicized? Because the government is involved in social media. It's putting pressure on social media companies. In every respect, things get politicized when politics intervenes in them, and because we live in a world with unlimited government, it might be limited in scope, in size, maybe, but it's not limited in scope. They'll do anything. Everything becomes politicized and everything becomes tribal, and I don't trust your information because I don't trust your science because you're a lefty. So I don't, people don't trust scientists because of their political standing. That's why I see the tribalism. I don't see tribalism when people decide between an Apple and a Dell computer. I mean, other than the people like me who buy Apple, clearly we're tribal, we'll buy anything Apple makes. But that is a choice. It's a complicated choice. It's computers. I don't know how computers work. And yet somehow I managed to choose a computer and to choose a phone. So it's not complexity, it's politics.
Thank you. Okay, now we have very little bit of time, so we'll go straight to the super chat. So we had one super chat from Hugh James. Thank you, Hugh. It doesn't say who the question is for, so I'll put it there and you can choose if you would like to answer it. Do you think Trump has set a status quo for American trade policy? Seems like Biden is America first in all but name, apart from immigration and climate.
I'll take this one. Yes, I mean, there's no question today in American politics, the people who believe in free trade, people who believe in trade are silent. So there's still some in Congress, in the Senate, in the House, but they won't speak because they're Republican. They tend to be Republicans who are afraid, or centrist Democrats, and their numbers are shrinking, but both the left and the right today in the United States are anti-trade. And this notion that Trump was just about trade with China and there's some justification and all of that is nonsense. I mean, we've got tariffs on Canada, we've got tariffs on Brazil, we've got tariffs and certainly threats of tariffs on the European Union, we've got threats of tariffs on our allies, not just our supposed enemies. So the voices of the free traders have shrunk dramatically in American politics. I don't think you get elected today in America if you advocated for free trade or you articulated any kind of free trade position.
Can I add that it is particularly, I'm delighted that this country is finally dropping the unscientific and needless checks on inward travellers. The United States is a long way from doing that. And what is even more bizarre about it is that the countries from which you are not allowed to travel to the US are those which happened to have high infection rates before the virus had reached the US, right? So it's like those Bordeaux wine classifications that reflect the ranking as it was in 1855, and no one has bothered to change them. So the Trump administration slapped these restrictions first on China, then on Iran, then on the EU, then on Britain, then on Brazil, India, South Africa, right? You cannot go to the US from those places, but you can go via Mexico, where the infection rate is way higher, the vaccine rate is way lower. You can go from the Seychelles, that is currently the most infected place in the world, from Barbados, from Peru, my native Peru, which has the highest death rate in the world, because, I'm sorry to say, there is no hurry to fix it, because Biden has clocked what Trump clocked before him, which is that there is a substantial chunk of the population that doesn't mind the borders being closed as a general principle, not as a response to the coronavirus, but as a desirable end in itself. And no one particularly wants to take that constituency on. Yeah, but there's a rationale. There's a rationale. We can disagree about it, right? But if you do not have the virus in your country, there is a rationale for a travel ban. The rationale for the Trump travel ban had expired by April of last year.
Thank you. Now, questions in the audience. I don't know how we're going to do this. Do you want to give them the microphone, Razi? I think Razi will give it.
I think Razi.
So I'll keep this one here.
Just yell and we'll repeat the question for you.
Does that work? Oh, wow, I have like a God voice.
As I said, just yell.
Yell.
Yell. We can hear you.
I mean, it's a little weird to be like yelling across a thing.
We can all hear you.
It's working now.
Can everyone hear me? Is that
Yeah.
So can I just maybe play just a slight devil's advocate? We'll just behaviors based on their external environment. So when we talk about tribalism and the attraction towards it, a lot of times when I've been overseas, it's a reaction to poor courts of law, poor rule of law. Like if you screw me over in a breach of contract and I can't sue you in a formal court, then I'm only going to do business with my friends, family, or tribe, right? So the allure of tribalism tends to occur not as a presupposition, not as a thing that people adopted when they started adopting tribalistic policies. It's a reaction, and possibly a rational reaction to the second thing, trade deficits. When we think about the United States, we have a huge trade deficit. We were able to get past that because effectively we have capital markets on the planet. We, 70% of the world's financial transactions pass through our institutions at least once. A small percentage. But then a large portion of our best and brightest get pulled into what can only be described as the world's biggest casino table. Is that any better for us as a country? For our directions? I don't know. But these are
I'm going to leave the trade one to Eamon because he hasn't. Adam Smith had a pretty good answer to that. But I just want to make the point on the tribalism. Of course, you're right. In countries where there is not this really very unusual rule of law, of course people deal in family and in kin groups. But I just want to leave you with the thought that is normal, right? We're the weird ones. We're the exception that have evolved a set of institutions where you can trust impartial justice from people that you don't know. That's extraordinary, geographically and historically. And even by the way, in an advanced Western society, I mean, if there are two accountants in a small town and one of them is your brother-in-law, you'd need a pretty good argument, right, to use the other one, right? So we're not immune to the pull of it, even in places that do have all of those accoutrements. But the ethic of my tribe good, your tribe bad is the oldest and most basic one in human society. And I'd really recommend, if you're looking for something to read over the autumn, this fantastic study of it, The Weirdest People in the World, by this behavioral psychologist, Joseph Henrich from Harvard, where he just shows how skewed almost all of our understanding of the discipline was by the fact that all of our subjects were basically students in Western universities, and that they were highly atypical because they had this concept of the individual. Can anyone remember the opening line of The Godfather? Anyone remember that? I believe in America. Exactly. It's the guy at the funeral director. I believe in America. Yeah. And he's coming to ask for justice because he's, if you like, the example of the person who's lived under the rule of law. He's trusted to impartial institutions, and it's failed him. His daughter's been sexually abused, and he hasn't had justice. And he's coming to Marlon Brando, who represents the more normal human way of doing things, right? Take direct physical reprisals against the people who have wronged me or have wronged a kinswoman of mine, right? And Marlon Brando keeps on saying, you've got to be in my tribe. Your wife, is a friend of mine. She doesn't even see you. Never call me Godfather. You show me no respect. He wants him to be part. He wants him to buy in. Yeah? And eventually the guy says, okay, what do you want me to do? And you see how much easier it is to make a drama on that old morality, right? Goodies and baddies, right? How difficult it would be to make a drama about the court case. Yeah, almost think of any drama you want. In Narcos, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones. It's just taken as read that we're on these people's side and against those. It's never, because that's how we used to think. Now, special prize for anyone who can remember the name of the funeral director in that opening scene. This is where you realize that Mario Puzo was onto something. Yeah. His name was Amerigo Bonacera. Good night, America. Right? You go down this road, it's all over.
Just quickly, I mean, I agree completely with that, and this is the point. The point is that we have the rule of law, or at least a semblance of the rule of law, and we're descending in that direction. So we have an individualistic society, a non-tribalistic society, a society based on the rule of law with the right institutions. Let's not give it up. Let's not go back to a mafia economy, which is what tribalism really is. It's the rule of brute force. So, you know, it's one thing to talk about, you know, if we were in the Middle Ages discussing this, but we're not. We're in a post-Enlightenment world. We know the benefits of abandoning tribalism in favor of these institutions, and we're seemingly giving that up, and that's the tragedy.
Someone's got to deal with the deficit. Does somebody else want to do that?
The deficit.
I'm happy to say about
the world's biggest casino as well. That stuck to me. So.
I don't really want to.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I mean, that conception of trade is completely wrong, and maybe it comes from the idea that you think of financial markets as a casino. Financial markets are not a casino. They're probably the most productive part of our economy. They allocate capital across an entire economy. They play a crucial role in the prosperity that we all enjoy. Without financial markets and institutions, none of this, none of the wealth that we have today would exist. So yes, we, in the United States, we buy Chinese goods. They get our dollars. Those dollars come back into the United States in form of financial investments. That is an enormous value to us. The fact that smart people are going into finance, great. It's why we're as rich as we are, because smart people for the last 200 years have been going into finance, and they're needed in finance, because the allocation of capital might be the most important thing that capitalism does.
We have 5 more minutes, so another question? Yeah? I don't know who. Just up there. Let's start from up there. Yeah. Yeah? Okay. Is the suspicion over the vaccine because it's mandated? Who wants to answer that?
Again, it's politicized, and it shouldn't be politicized. I don't trust the vaccine because the FDA said I should trust it. I trust it because a bunch of really, really, really smart scientists at Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca said it's safe. I trust the scientists more than I trust the bureaucrats at the health agencies, more than I trust the politicians who are guiding us. So, you know, make a judgment based on the science.
Yeah, I think look, it comes down to whether you see it as an externality, right? If you are mandating something for the sake of the health of other people, then there is an argument for it. But the more we found out about how these vaccines work in reality, and this isn't what we thought at the start, they're really, really good at keeping you alive. They're really, really good at keeping you out of intensive care. They're only moderately good at preventing infection and preventing transmission. So it seems to me that the externality argument of, look, it's not yourself you're putting at risk, it's everyone around you, is much, much weaker than we thought it would be. Mm-hmm. And in the end, if that's the case, if not choosing to get vaccinated is your own risk, then the argument for compulsion, or indeed the argument for passports or whatever, it seems to me goes up in smoke.
One more question. Marvin?
That's the main way in which it is done now. So tariffs are very low globally by historical standards. The most common trade barrier is the non-tariff variety. So, for example, I was in Uganda just before the lockdown, talking to people who were trying to sell to the EU and were finding difficulties, so that we could identify obstacles that we could remove after Brexit. And almost always, they were things that were very subtle. For example, I met the Federation of Vanilla Growers, right? And they said, in theory, we're allowed to sell all the vanilla we want. There's no tariff. In practice, the standards are set by 2 French lobbyists who have substantial interests in plantations in Madagascar in such a way that only their vanilla meets the standard. And, of course, this is what happens with... This is the problem with all trade barriers. They are presented as being about environmental protection or consumer rights or something. They're always about a cartel wishing to disadvantage a rival. The thing that surprised me most when I was elected to the European Parliament in 1999, God, I was innocent. As a Conservative, I thought that the companies won't want all these regulations. that belief lasted for about 5 days there. I mean, I was constantly being lobbied by big corporates saying, we want this or that rule. And it was almost always that there was a standard that they happened to meet anyway, but that a competitor didn't, and that they wanted the EU to make this mandatory so as to put all their rivals out of business. But they weren't idiots, right? They would say, oh, this is all about better information for customers or something. I mean, they knew that they had to sell it in a way that the public would. So one very, very big tech firm, the guy who had been their lobbyist, I saw him much later when he'd stopped working for them. And I said, I read that thing that you were lobbying for cost you, tens of billions of dollars. He goes, yeah. We knew that we were the only company that could afford that. Right? So this is where a lot of it comes from.
I think we have time for one more question, if it's quick. Okay, we'll go to that side. We'll go first up there.
In the United States, in New Hampshire, there's such a thing as the Free State Project, and there's currently a movement to secede from the Union. And I'm just wondering, in terms of tribalism versus trade, how would you rate their chances of success given the prevalence of collectivism and just protectionism in the United States?
0. I mean, this free New Hampshire has been going on for, I don't know, 20 years. I've been hearing about it. As far as I know, they have, New Hampshire's become a democratic state during that period, not even moved towards more free markets. So, I mean, no, it's a fantasy. It's a fantasy that the United States would let any state secede. It's not happening. If you want low taxes, the only place on planet Earth where U.S. global income is not taxed, there's only one place, and that is Puerto Rico.
Sorry, may I make one more point about that? I mean, I think even before 20 years ago, Ron Paul was always talking about the northern secessionists prior to the Civil War. There was an abolitionist movement in the not a small one, but I think it's historically interesting, saying we should secede so that we are not sullied by the abomination of slavery. So I suspect there were some secessionists in New England before. But I agree, it's not going to happen. And the U.S. Constitution always struck me as being having an odd lacuna. It goes into great detail on whether you need 2 witnesses in a treason trial, and it doesn't mention whether you're allowed to leave. I'll just make a separate point, though. I live in Old Hampshire, which, if you count it on the full county borders, has the same population as New Hampshire. New Hampshire, unlike Hampshire, has its own legal system, its own police force, its own tax system, its own welfare system. Short of secession, it must always be a good thing to take decisions as closely as possible to the people that they affect. And one thing I would love to do is to re-import our revolution and return to the idea of the dispersal and devolution and democratization of power. I refuse to believe that people in England are uniquely incapable of local self-government. And one thing that I think would make government smaller and more accountable is bringing it closer to the electorate.
Right. Thank you all very much. I think we've exceeded our time, so we're going to go to a quick break of 10 minutes, and then we'll come back with the next panel. Thank you very much for this discussion.